Welcome to an Introduction to Strategic Foresight learning module. My name is Yvette Montero-Savatico, and over the next few minutes, I'm going to take you through some of the key principles of the field, as well as a history of the future, the business case for foresight, and a look inside our natural foresight framework. Let's start with that business case. The U.S. military coined a phrase 20 years ago called VUCA. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And this phrase has really been adopted by entrepreneurs, business leaders, advocates of all types to really talk about the environment that we're in and why we need a different type of operating system. Let's talk about each of these segments individually. With volatility, we're talking about not just changes in technology. I know, we've seen exponential change in technology, of course, but volatility is really speaking to the fact that the periods between eras are shortening. So whereas we had many decades to get used to going from being farmers to being manufacturers, now the time between those economic transitions is much shorter. And I should mention that I'm really fond of saying that the future is not about technology, and that's because the exponential change we're seeing is across all domains, whether it's demographics, societal change, economic upheaval. We're seeing volatility across all of those segments. So let's talk about uncertainty. When I talk about uncertainty, I like to talk about this concept called educated incapacity, or the illusion of certainty. What's educated incapacity? It's the idea that you know so much about what you know that you're the last to know that things are changing. And unfortunately, we all suffer from it, me included. So what can we do to overcome educated incapacity? Well, we have to look from the outside in and really challenge our biases and assumptions around our subject matter expertise. And Foresight helps us do that. C in VUCA is for complexity. And so a lot of major publications like to every couple of weeks come out with new articles talking about killing complexity, slaying complexity, simplifying complexity. And not only is this ridiculous, it's impossible. Complexity is like the genie. It's already out of the bottle. And I'll take it one step further to say that complexity is actually not the enemy. Complexity actually affords us greater opportunity, a greater landscape from which to create from. What we often do in our outdated mindsets is we confuse complication with complexity. Let me explain the difference. Complexity is the natural order of things. As things grow in nature and mature, they become more complex. Complication is what we do to ourselves. We add additional processes, additional steps to try to overcome the growing complexity. Foresight helps us update our operating system and our mindsets to deal with the growing complexity and leverage it. Last but not least, ambiguity. Ambiguity is kind of like uncertainty, which we talked about before. Let me explain the difference. With uncertainty, imagine that you have a set of dice and you're going to roll them. You don't know exactly what value is going to come, but you're pretty certain it's going to be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. With ambiguity, you don't even know if you have dice or how many sides they have. We don't know what the variables are going to be in the future. So our traditional ways of planning, of looking to the past and extrapolating to the future, are just no longer effective. Strategic foresight addresses that by allowing us to create new vistas of the future to better plan and make decisions today. So VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, really gives us the business case or the rationale of why strategic foresight is such an imperative. Now that we've discussed the business case for strategic foresight, let's talk a little bit about the history of the future. The field itself has been around for over 100 years, with organizations, both in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors, and even governments, employing strategic foresight for planning purposes. In fact, many of the brands that you know and love employ futurists, brands like Disney and Intel. And the government of Singapore, they use strategic foresight every year to drive their long-term planning processes. And another famous example would be Shell Oil, who in the 1970s really credits scenario planning, one of the main tools in strategic foresight, with not just allowing them to weather the storm, but really propel themselves to the top of the industry. So now that we know that strategic foresight is used across the globe and within many different sectors, let's talk a little bit about what type of thinking it drives. Strategic foresight allows us to be more adaptive, resilient, and transformative. Rather than attempting to predict the future, which we can't, strategic foresight gives us the frameworks and tools to allow us to map the future. And from that map, we can pull to today new ideas to inform our strategies and decision making. And that's an important point. Strategic foresight and futures thinking isn't really about the future at all. It's about the present. Because how we think about the future, whether consciously or unconsciously, directly impacts the actions we take every day. So strategic foresight allows us to make better decisions, more collaborative and more aspirational decisions in the present. An important framework within strategic foresight is the idea of the push and pull of the future. So let me explain that. So the push and pull of the future really describes the fact that the future exists across a spectrum. On the side of the push, we have those trends and emerging issues that are pushing us to the future, whether we like it or not. Most organizations and individuals spend an incredible amount of time on the push side of the future, often ignoring the other side of the spectrum, the pull of the future. The best way to explain the pull of the future is probably to describe where we got the name of our firm, Kedge. So a kedge, if you're not familiar, is a smaller anchor on a sailing vessel. And when there was no wind at sea, they would take the newer sailors and put them on a rowboat, take the kedge attached to a really long rope and send them in the direction that the vessel wanted to head. When they reached the end of the rope, they'd drop the kedge. Those remaining on the larger vessel would then pull themselves repeatedly until they arrived at that location or until the wind picked up. Similarly, a kedge represents our aspirational vision or the thing we're trying to pull ourselves or organizations to. So when we talk about the pull of the future, it's acknowledging the trends and emerging issues and migrating towards our aspirations. But the coolest thing about using strategic foresight across the full spectrum of the push and pull of the future is that when we do these tools well and when we do them across our organization, what we find is that we can pull that future to today. So again, the future is not about the future is about today. So it's clear strategic foresight is an established discipline, but we believe it's best served as a philosophy, running in the background of all our efforts, whether it's leadership development, executive development, strategy, innovation, change management. Think of it as your operating system, fueling all of those efforts with foresight. That's the critical way that we can succeed going into the 22nd century. There's many frameworks available. Our framework is called the Natural Foresight Framework, and it's developed with the natural growth curves or S-curves running in the background. This makes it a more organic process which works in our complex environments way better than just a series of steps. I'm going to take you through the different elements of our Natural Foresight Framework, starting with Discover. So in the Discover facet of the Natural Foresight Framework, we're really challenging our assumptions and biases. We know that we're exposed to so much information every day, but we can't process all of it consciously. In fact, did you know that 99.999996% of the information we process unconsciously? Now, that doesn't mean that you're asleep when you're processing that information. It just means that you're relying on existing or older mental models, likely formed in a previous era. And so what happens is you get a new piece of information, you filter it based on what you already know. If the new piece of information is at odds with what you already know, you automatically discount it. You don't even realize you're doing it. So that's a really dangerous practice when the world is moving so quickly in a VUCA environment. What strategic foresight allows us to do is challenge those assumptions and biases, which, by the way, we all have. Remember, we're all suffering from educated incapacity. Through strategic foresight, we can challenge our assumptions and biases, utilizing a number of different tools in the framework. So that's the Discover facet. Let's move on to Explore. In the Explore phase, we're scanning the external environment for trends and emerging issues. But it's not just trend hunting. In fact, trends, we often say, can be our worst enemy. Why is that? Well, somewhere along the way, the word trend became synonymous with the future. But the fact is, if I can see a trend, it's the present. So while trends are an important part of the futurist toolkit, they're just the beginning. We have to analyze trends to understand the value shifts that predicated them and the impacts and implications that are going to result from them. In fact, we don't just stop at trends, we look at the patterns or the collisions of those trends to make sense of those emerging landscapes of change. This is what makes foresight different from other methodologies that may on the surface look similar. Things like competitive intelligence or consumer insights. Those are all great fields, but foresight is different. It works from the outside in as we scan that broad macro environment for changes across society, technology, economics, the environment, and policy. We make sense of those weak signals, we understand why they're occurring and what might happen because of them, and we make better decisions today because of that. So, now that we understand discover and explore, let's move on to the mapping phase of the natural foresight framework. This might be the most commonly known phase of strategic foresight, as many people have been exposed to scenario planning. But mapping is more than scenario planning. In fact, mapping is really about thinking in simultaneous multiples. What do I mean by that? Well, from where we stand today, there are an unlimited number of futures before us. Strategic foresight through the mapping phase allows us to mine all those different potential futures to make better decisions in the present. And that could be through scenario planning efforts, but it could also be through tools like futures wheels and other tools within the natural foresight framework. So, we know how to discover and challenge our assumptions and biases. We know how to scan the environment through the explore phase. We've created multiple maps of the future in the mapping phase. Now let's move on to create. In the create phase, we're really focused on understanding how to fuel our organizations and ourselves with foresight. How do we create organizations whose operating systems work on strategic foresight? That's what the create phase is all about. It's challenging our thought processes around value creation and value measurement. And foresight allows us to do that. There are many tools to help evaluate the health and your future readiness, both individually and organizationally. And using strategic foresight will help improve those areas tremendously. We're all creating the future every day with the decisions we make. Through the natural foresight framework, we aim to create those decisions more collaboratively and more aspirationally. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to strategic foresight, where we've shared the history of the future as well as a glimpse into our natural foresight framework. If you're looking for more resources on natural foresight or strategic foresight, please download our primer or take a look at our guide to the natural foresight framework. Thank you.